Peace negotiations fail. Humans' reply terrifies the galaxy. The folder landed on the table with a soft thud, and the moment I saw Dr. Clara Voss slide it across without even looking at me, I knew this meeting was already different from every other negotiation I had ever attended. I am Ambassador Susolu of the Vicari delegation, senior representative of the Galactic Conclave, and I have spent 112 years of my life sitting across tables from species who did not want to listen to me. I have negotiated the end of the Thren hegemony. I have brokered agreements between the Duan, who experience time in reverse, and the Gallic, who communicate entirely through scent. I have never lost a negotiation. I have never needed to threaten a species more than once. I had never, until that afternoon at Reach Station Kepler 7, felt something cold move through me that I could not explain with logic or data. The terms we brought were generous. I want to be clear about that. The Galactic Conclave did not arrive at that station with cruelty in our hearts. We arrived with patience, and with a solution that any reasonable species would have accepted within the first hour. Humanity had been expanding for 2 centuries, quietly and steadily, pushing into systems that fell under conclave-mapped territories, establishing colonies on planets listed as reserved for future development, and signing trade agreements with smaller species without conclave approval. They were not doing it out of aggression. That was the assessment of our Xenodiplomacy division. They were doing it the way a river moves around rocks, not to defy the rocks, but because the river does not think about rocks at all. That too was a mistake in our thinking. I understand that now. Our fleet positioned itself in orbit above Kepler 7 before the meeting. 17 warships. Not a gesture of hostility, a gesture of legitimacy. When the Conclave speaks, it speaks with weight. That is how diplomacy has always worked with every species we have encountered. The weight of the fleet behind our words was simply context. It said, "We are serious. We would like this resolved peacefully." I beamed down to the station with my full delegation. The human station was functional and clean, built with that particular human preference for wide corridors and excessive lighting. Everything was slightly too bright. I noticed the humans on the station moving around us with careful courtesy, stepping aside, offering refreshment, smiling in that particular way humans smile when they are not smiling about anything. It is a thing they do with their faces, a social reflex. I had been briefed on it. I found it no less unsettling for being briefed. Dr. Clara Voss was already in the room when we arrived. She was not what I expected. She was a small woman, perhaps 60 years by human reckoning, with short gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she spent most of her time at desks rather than at podiums. She wore a plain dark jacket, no medals, no insignia of rank beyond a small conclave guest pin on her lapel, which she had placed at a slightly crooked angle. I could not determine if the crookedness was accidental or deliberate. She stood when we entered, offered a handshake to me in the human fashion, and then sat back down and folded her hands on the table. No aides, no military advisors, no legal team, just Dr. Clara Voss, one data tablet, and a cup of something hot that steamed gently on the table beside her. I presented our terms. I presented them in full, with translation running through the room's speakers in Standard Galactic and in English simultaneously, so there could be no claim of misunderstanding. The terms were as follows. Humanity would withdraw from 11 contested outer system colonies, 3 of which were the most recently established. Humanity would accept a cap on new fleet construction of no more than 400 vessels per decade. Humanity would submit its artificial intelligence research programs to quarterly review by a conclave oversight committee. In exchange, the conclave would formally recognize all 22 existing human colonies as sovereign territories, guarantee humanity's seat on the Outer Species Advisory Council, a permanent seat, with speaking rights, which was more than any species at humanity's developmental stage had ever been offered, and open 7 conclave trade lanes to human commercial vessels. It was, in any objective measure, a very good deal for them. Dr. Voss received the folder. She opened it. She read the first page. She turned to the second page. She read the second page. Then she closed the folder. She looked at me for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with fear. She looked at me the way an engineer might look at a blueprint that she was seeing for the first time and needed a moment to understand fully. It was careful. It was quiet. And there was something behind her eyes that I could not read, even after a century of reading the faces of alien species. She said, "Is this your final offer, Ambassador?" I told her it was. She nodded once. Then she said they would need 72 hours to consider. I told her that was acceptable. She stood, thanked me for coming, and left the room. Her cup was still on the table, still steaming. She had not taken a single sip. That evening, in my quarters aboard the Conclave flagship, I reviewed the session recording 3 times. I was looking for something I could not name. The session had gone smoothly. The human had received the terms, acknowledged them, and requested a standard deliberation period. Nothing about the interaction was unusual. I had seen this pattern 10,000 times. A species receives terms it does not like, asks for time, and comes back either with a counteroffer or a quiet acceptance. What I was looking for, I realized, was something that should have been there and was not. Dr. Voss had shown no distress, no calculation, no visible awareness that 17 warships were sitting in orbit above her station. Species with warships above them behave in a certain way. They carry a particular tightness in their faces, a careful control of their breathing, an awareness of the ceiling. It is subconscious, almost always, but it is there. I have never seen it absent, not once, not in any species I have ever met. Dr. Voss had not looked at the ceiling a single time. I ran the recording again. At the 53rd minute of my review, my communications officer reported something to my console directly, rather than over the shared channel, which was the protocol for information he did not want the rest of the delegation to hear in that moment. A tight beam signal had been detected departing Kepler 7 station at 21:04 station time. It had lasted 11 seconds. It was directed not toward any inhabited system the Conclave had on record, but toward a region of deep space that our charts marked as surveyed and empty. The signal was encrypted in a cipher format that our best translation systems returned as unrecognized. I sat with that information for a long time. Tight beam signals from stations under negotiation were not unusual. Species under diplomatic pressure communicated with their home governments constantly. That was expected. What was not expected was a signal sent toward empty space, in a cipher we had never seen, from a species that had just been handed the most generous terms the Conclave had offered to any new species in 40 years, and whose lead diplomat had not blinked, had not tightened her jaw, had not looked at the ceiling, had not touched her drink. I told my communications officer to log the signal, and to say nothing about it until I gave further instruction. Then I sat at my desk for the remaining hours of the night, and tried to remember if there was anything in our intelligence files about what humanity had been doing for the last 80 years. We called that period the quiet years in our reports. Between the years 2180 and 2260, by the human calendar, human expansion had slowed dramatically. Signal traffic from their systems decreased. Their presence at minor trade outposts reduced. The Conclave's assessment at the time had been that humanity was going through a period of internal consolidation, economic difficulty, political reorganization, the usual growing pains of a species reaching the middle phase of its development. It was not unusual. Dozens of species had gone through similar contractions. We had not looked closely. There had been no reason to look closely. Humanity was, at the time, a minor species, a footnote in the Conclave's records, a river we expected to keep moving around rocks. I pulled up our intelligence files on the quiet years and read them through until the station's lights shifted to morning cycle. The files were very thin. I had not noticed, until that moment, how very thin they were. Outside my viewport, the 17 ships of the Conclave fleet sat in perfect orbit above Kepler 7, clean and large and powerful, and the station below them showed no lights, no movement, no sign that anyone inside was anxious about anything at all. 71 hours and 43 minutes from the moment Dr. Voss had left the room, my communications officer reported that the human delegation had returned to the negotiating chamber and was requesting our presence. They were 17 minutes early. I straightened my diplomatic sash, told my delegation to follow me, and walked toward the shuttle bay with the first genuine uncertainty I had felt in 30 years of service, pressed against the back of my mind, like a stone I could not put down. I did not tell anyone what I was feeling. That, too, is something I understand differently now. Dr. Voss had not told me what she was feeling either. Perhaps we were more alike in that moment than I would ever have admitted. The shuttle docked, the airlock opened, and the first thing I noticed was that Clara Voss was not alone. She stood at the head of the negotiating table in the same dark jacket she had worn the day before, her hands at her sides, her posture exactly as it had been, straight, relaxed, unhurried. But behind her, arranged in a loose line along the back wall of the chamber, were 7 people in plain gray uniforms. The uniforms had no rank markings, no patches, no insignia of any kind. The 7 people standing in them were of different heights and builds, different ages, and they stood with the specific stillness of people who have learned to wait in exactly that way, not at attention, not relaxed, but simply present in a way that took up no more space than necessary, while somehow filling the room completely. They did not sit. They did not introduce themselves. They did not speak. I took my seat. My delegation took theirs. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at Dr. Voss and waited for her to begin. Because something in the room had shifted in a direction I could not name, and I had learned in my century of diplomacy that when a room shifts in a direction you cannot name, you do not speak first. Clara Voss said, "Thank you for coming back, Ambassador. We've reviewed your terms." I told her we were glad to hear it and asked if humanity had reached a decision. She said, "We'd like to give you some context before we answer that question." I told her we were listening. She picked up her data tablet. She did not hand it to me. She set it flat on the table facing me, and on its screen was a single image, a star field. Specifically, a region I recognized as the outer edge of the Velar Drift, a sector of space between human territory and the nearest conclave border systems. The sector was charted as navigational hazard due to high stellar density, difficult to transit, largely avoided. She said, "Between 2181 and 2259, we were quiet. You noticed that. Your intelligence files flag it as a period of internal consolidation. I acknowledged that this was our assessment." She said, "We were building." She tapped the screen. The star field changed. What replaced it was not a diagram or a schematic. It was a sensor reading, formatted in a data type I recognized as Conclave Standard, our own format, which meant it had been pulled from a Conclave-compatible scanner. The reading showed mass signatures, hundreds of them, arranged in holding positions deep within the stellar bodies of 17 red dwarf stars in the Velar Drift, using the stars themselves as cover, the way a species hides something when it wants to be absolutely certain no one finds it by accident. My translation systems put the mass figures on the side of the screen in a column. I looked at the column for a long moment, then I looked at it again. Then I asked my communications officer, who was seated beside me, to run the figures through our fleet mass database and tell me what class of vessel corresponded to those signatures. He did so. He read the result to me quietly, directly into my ear, so that only I could hear. The signatures corresponded to warship-class vessels. The specific displacement matched a human vessel type we had catalogued, but had only ever observed in numbers of between 40 and 60 at any given time during our monitoring of human fleet activity. The number of signatures in the sensor reading was not 40 or 60. I asked him, quietly, to confirm the number. He confirmed it. 9,112 vessels. Sitting inside the photospheres of red dwarf stars, shielded from every scanning frequency the Conclave used, for 80 years, in a sector of space we had assessed as too difficult to be worth monitoring closely. I set my hands flat on the table again, very carefully. Clara Voss was watching me. Her expression had not changed. She said, "We call it Project Stillwater. The name refers to the way deep water looks calm on the surface." I said nothing. She reached into the folder in front of her and removed a single data chip. She slid it across the table to me. She said, "That contains the specifications of a device our physics division completed in 2247. You're welcome to have your scientists verify the specifications. We'd prefer you to, actually. We find that things go more smoothly when all parties have accurate information." I picked up the chip. I handed it to my science advisor without looking away from Clara Voss. She said, "The device collapses a jump lane permanently. Not temporarily disrupted, permanently closed. The underlying spacefold degrades at a rate that cannot be reversed with any technology we've encountered in Conclave archives." My science advisor had connected the chip to his portable reader. He was silent for 4 seconds. Then he said to me, in Vicari, in a voice that was very level, "The physics appear sound. The Galactic Conclave maintains transit through 47 primary jump lanes, connecting our member homeworlds to one another. Those lanes represent centuries of infrastructure. The movement of populations, food, medicine, military response, cultural exchange, everything that holds the Conclave together as a functioning body, passes through those 47 lanes. If even a third of them were closed permanently, the logistical consequences would be generational. I looked at Clara Voss. She looked at me. I said, "How many of these devices have you built?" She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled during either session. It was not an unkind smile. It was the smile of a person who has been asked a question they have been expecting for some time. She said, "I think the more useful question is the one you'd rather not ask." I asked it anyway. "Are they already deployed?" She said, "Do you remember the tight beam signal from last night?" I felt something that, in a being with a physical cardiovascular system, I believe would be described as the heart dropping. I am Vakari. We do not have hearts in the human sense, but something inside me dropped. She said, "The signal was a cancellation order. Something was already moving. We stopped it, because we'd like to resolve this without anyone making a decision they can't take back." She paused. "The devices respond to a second signal. We haven't sent that one." The 7 people along the wall had not moved, had not shifted their weight, had not looked at anything except the middle distance. I looked at them again and understood, in a way I had not understood when I first entered the room, that they were not security. They were not advisors. They were the people who sent signals. Clara Voss said, "We're not interested in destroying the Conclave's infrastructure. We want to be clear about that. We are interested in a different conversation than the one your terms described." I asked what conversation she had in mind. She said, "A fair one." She opened her folder and removed a second document. She did not push it across the table. She set it in front of her and looked at it for a moment, before looking back at me. She said, "We'd like full trade access to the 7 Conclave commercial lanes. We'd like recognition of all 31 human colonies, not 22. We'd like our AI research to remain unmonitored. We'd like a permanent seat on the main Conclave Council, not the Advisory Council, and we'd like the contested outer systems to remain ours." It was the mirror image of our terms. Everything we had asked them to surrender, they were asking us to grant. Everything we had offered them, they were asking for more of. I said, "You understand what you're asking?" She said, "We've had 80 years to think about it." I said, "The Conclave will not accept these terms." She said, "I know." She said it without any frustration, without any challenge. She said it the way someone says a thing they already knew, and were simply confirming. "That's why we're not asking the Conclave. We're telling you what we want, so that when you go back and explain what happened here, you have accurate information. We find that things go more smoothly when all parties have accurate information." She had used that exact phrase twice now. I noticed that. I believe she intended me to notice it. I looked at the 7 people along the wall again. One of them, the one nearest the door, a woman with short red hair, who had not blinked perceptibly since I entered the room, was holding a small communications device, loosely in her right hand. She was not gripping it. She was simply holding it. The way someone holds something they do not need to grip, because they are not worried about dropping it. I asked Clara Voss for time to contact the Conclave. She said we could have as much time as we needed. She offered refreshment again. I declined again. She poured herself a cup from the same flask she had brought the day before, drank from it calmly, and waited. I stepped away from the table and opened a private channel to the flagship. The first thing Admiral Kren said when he answered was that his tactical systems had been tracking something unusual for the past 40 minutes, and he had been about to contact me. I asked him to tell me what he was tracking. There was a pause. He said, "New contacts. Multiple. We're still resolving the count." I asked for his best current estimate. He said, "The number keeps going up." Outside the viewport behind Clara Voss, the stars were still. The Velar drift was 3 light hours away. Nothing that had been sitting inside 17 red dwarf stars for 80 years was visible from here with the naked eye. But Admiral Kren could see them on his tactical display, and the count was still going up, and Clara Voss was drinking her cup of something hot, with the same calm she had carried into this room from the very first moment I met her, and I was beginning to understand that the quiet years had not been quiet at all. They had been the loudest 80 years in human history. We had simply not been listening. I have been in 416 engagements over 62 years of service to the Galactic Conclave Warband fleet. I have faced species that grew to 4 times human height. I have faced automated weapon platforms that could sustain fire for 11 days without stopping. I have faced the Duan, whose ships reform after being cut in half because their hulls are partly biological. In 416 engagements, I have retreated 8 times. Each of those 8 retreats was a tactical decision, made with full information and a clear head. I am not ashamed of any of them. I am Admiral Kren, and what happened above Kepler 7 was not a retreat I planned. I had my guns charged from the moment the shuttle carrying Ambassador Solu left for the station. This is standard procedure. When the Conclave negotiates, the fleet behind it is ready. The power of the fleet is not a threat. It is context. It says, we are serious. It has always been sufficient context. In 600 years of Conclave diplomatic history, no species at humanity's developmental stage had ever looked at a Conclave fleet in orbit above them and decided that the best response was anything other than careful conversation. I expected careful conversation. At the 43-minute mark of the second session, my tactical officer said, Admiral, new contacts. I looked at the display. There were ships dropping out of jump, not from the direction of human-controlled space, from the Villar Drift. From inside the drift, which our charts marked as high stellar density, poor transit conditions, not a viable approach vector for any fleet operating at standard parameters. The count on my display began at 11, then it jumped to 40, then it jumped again. My tactical officer said, in a voice that was doing an admirable job of staying flat, count is still updating. I told him to give me the best current estimate. He said, Sir, the system is having difficulty with the resolution at this range. The contacts are emerging in a formation pattern I don't have a reference for. I told him to describe the formation. He said, a sphere. They're arranging themselves in a sphere around our position. A sphere. Around our position. 17 ships in the center. An unknown number on the outside. I told my weapons officer to confirm gun status. He confirmed. All charged. All targeted. Ready to fire within 4 seconds of my order. I looked at the display and watched the count update. The resolution was improving as the contacts moved closer, and our sensors got better readings. The first number that came back clearly was 117. I thought, 117 is manageable. We are 17 warships. 117 against 17 is a difficult engagement, not an impossible one. Then the resolution improved again, and my tactical officer said, Sir, the previous count was reading 1 contact per cluster. The clusters are formations. Individual ships per cluster are, he stopped. I said, say the number. He said, 1,170. Confirmed. The system has full resolution now. I looked at the sphere of contacts on my tactical display. 1,170 ships arranged in a perfect geometric shell around my fleet of 17. The math was not something I needed a computer to do for me. The ratio was 68-1. In any engagement doctrine I had ever studied, a ratio of 68-1 was not a tactical situation. It was a conclusion waiting to happen. My weapons officer said, without being asked, Sir, at this ratio, even if we achieve a firing solution on every vessel in the first volley, their return fire volume would... I told him to stop. He stopped. I sat in my command chair and looked at the display and thought, for what felt like a long time but was probably 6 seconds, about the 8 retreats I had ordered in my career. I thought about what had made each of them the right decision. In every case, the answer had been the same. The information available to me made it clear that continuing would result in total loss with no strategic benefit. A commander who continues in that situation is not brave. A commander who continues in that situation is simply wrong. My communications officer said, Admiral, open channel from the station. It's been flagged as originating from the human negotiating party. I told him to put it through. A voice came over the channel. Female. Calm. Slightly tired, the way someone sounds when they are at the end of a very long day, but are managing it well. She said, Admiral Kren, your fleet is currently inside a containment envelope. You have 90 seconds to decide what you'd like to do about that. I'd suggest you take the time. There's no benefit to rushing. I said, who am I speaking with? She said, Dr. Clara Voss, Human Diplomatic Delegation. We've been in the next room having a conversation with your ambassador. It's going well, I think, though I'll admit the first few minutes were a bit tense. I looked at the display again. 1,170 ships, a perfect sphere, every vessel holding position with a precision that my fleet could not have matched on its best training exercise. I said, what are your terms for our withdrawal? She said, leave the system the way you came in, standard transit speed, no weapons hot, no sensor sweeps of the drift on your way out. When you get back to Conclave space, please tell whoever sent you that we'd appreciate it if they sent someone with full decision-making authority next time. Ambassador Solu is excellent, and we have a lot of respect for him. But the terms he brought today weren't something we could work with, and we think the people who wrote those terms should understand that directly. I said, that is all? She said, that's all. Safe travels, Admiral. The channel closed. I sat for a moment longer. Then I opened the fleet-wide channel and gave the order. All ships, weapons stand down. Disengage targeting. Prepare for departure on my mark. My weapons officer, to his credit, did not question the order. My tactical officer said, the sphere is parting. They're opening a corridor, directly behind us, the direction we came in from. I said, then we'll use it. As we moved through the corridor, my sensors picked up detailed readings of the human ships closest to our path. They were, as our database had catalogued, a type we had seen before in smaller numbers, heavier than they looked, built with an interior redundancy that suggested designers who had thought very hard about what happened when a ship took damage, and kept being asked to fight anyway. The crews, where I could pick up biosins through the hull, were calm, metabolically calm. The kind of calm that is not performed but is simply the state of people who are where they expected to be, doing what they expected to do. None of them had pointed a weapon at us. That detail stayed with me the entire transit out of the system. They had been given 68 opportunities for every one of ours, and they had not pointed a single weapon. The sphere had been a statement of capability, not a threat of action. They had shown us what they had, and then opened the door, and said, you can go now. I have thought about what that means for a long time since that day. A species that needs to threaten you is not certain. A species that needs to threaten you still has doubt somewhere in the equation, and that doubt expresses itself as the need to make you afraid. A species that shows you the math and then holds the door open is a species that has already finished the calculation and found the result so clear that there is no need for anything else. By the time we cleared the system boundary and I began composing my report to the conclave, I had stopped thinking about the 1,170 ships. I was thinking about Clara Voss's voice on that channel, slightly tired, calm, telling me I had 90 seconds and suggesting, gently, that there was no benefit to rushing. She had been right. There had been no benefit to rushing. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you have. I have felt it myself, on the good days, when I have known my fleet, known my position, known my plan, and walked into an engagement with the result already clear in my mind. It is a quiet feeling. It does not need to shout. Clara Voss had that feeling. Every human in that room had that feeling. Every human on those 1,170 ships had that feeling. And the conclave, for the first time in 600 years, did not. I filed my report. I included the number. I included the formation. I included the voice on the channel, and the exact words spoken, and the 90 seconds, and the open corridor, and the fact that no weapon had been pointed. I sent the report and sat in my command chair as the fleet moved away from Kepler 7 at standard transit speed, with weapons stood down, and I thought, someone in the conclave is going to read this report and call an emergency session. And then, they are going to have a conversation that I am very glad I will not have to be in the room for. The emergency session of the Galactic Conclave was called within 6 hours of my report arriving, which was faster than any session had been called in the previous 40 years. I know because I checked the records on the transit back, while I could not sleep, which was new for me. I have slept through worse. I am Solu, and I walked into that session knowing two things that no one else in the chamber had yet internalized: the number of ships in the sphere above Kepler 7, and the sound of Clara Voss's voice when she asked if I remembered the tight beam signal. The grand chamber of the conclave on the homeworld Erathis is the largest interior space I have ever occupied. Its ceiling is so high that a separate atmosphere management system is required for the upper third of the room, because without it, the temperature differential causes weather inside a building. The chamber holds representatives from 47 member species, and has done so continuously for 6 centuries. The walls are lined with the records of every agreement the conclave has ever brokered, etched into panels of a mineral that does not decay. It is a room designed to make whoever stands in it feel the weight of history and the permanence of the institution. I have always found it impressive. Walking into it on that particular morning, I found it fragile in a way I had never noticed before. The session opened with my report. I stood at the central floor and read it aloud, which is the tradition when the reporting party is present. I read the number. I read the sphere formation. I read the specifications from the data chip, which our science division had confirmed overnight as physically valid. The lane collapse device worked on principles we had not previously considered, but could not disprove. I read Clara Voss's words back to the chamber exactly as she had said them, because exact words matter in these situations, and I had recorded the session precisely for that reason. The chamber was quiet, in a way that a room of 47 species is not usually quiet. 47 species produce a great deal of ambient sound simply by existing in a shared space. Breathing patterns, movement, the low tones of translation systems, the small sounds of different physiologies managing different environments. All of that was present. But the quality of attention in the room had changed the moment I read the number. 1,170. I watched it land. The representative from the Erathi home system, the species that had contributed 16 of the 17 ships in the diplomatic fleet, including Admiral Kren's flagship, said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Confirm the sensor resolution." I confirmed it. Full resolution. Confirmed by 3 independent sensor arrays on 3 separate ships before we left the system. She said nothing more. The representative from the Gallic, the species who had been most vocal in drafting the original terms, who had argued most forcefully in the pre-session briefings that humanity would accept because humanity had no realistic alternative, said, "The lane collapse device cannot be real. Our physics does not permit it." Our science advisor, seated in the support tier, said, "Our physics did not permit it as of 18 months ago. The specifications on the chip indicate a theoretical approach we hadn't considered. Our team ran preliminary models overnight. The approach is valid. We have not yet determined if the power requirements are achievable, but the principles are sound." The Gallic representative said, "Preliminary models in one night are not confirmation." Our science advisor said, "No, but they're not dismissal either." There was a pause. Someone from the back of the chamber, I could not immediately identify the species, said, "How many devices have they built?" I said, "They did not tell us the number." The chamber processed that. I let it process. I had thought carefully on the transit about how to present the information from the session, and the conclusion I had reached was that the most useful thing I could do was present it with complete accuracy and allow the chamber to feel what it was going to feel without me shaping the feeling. A diplomat who shapes the feeling is an advocate. I was not there as an advocate. I was there as someone who had been in the room and had seen clearly. What happened in the chamber over the next 4 hours was something I had not seen in 112 years of attending conclave sessions. It was not panic. The conclave does not panic. The institution is too old for that, and the species in it are too experienced. What happened was more like a very slow and very careful recalibration, like a long-range navigation system that has been running on a set of assumptions and has just received data that requires it to pause, recalculate, and start again from a corrected position. The species that had voted most forcefully for the original terms to humanity were, one by one, asking their defense ministers quiet questions. The defense ministers were, one by one, stepping out of the chamber to take calls. The ministers were returning with expressions that told me, without needing to say anything else, that the answers they had received were not the answers they had expected or hoped for. By the end of the second hour, 3 of the 47 member species had opened back-channel communications with human embassies in their respective home systems. I know because my communications team was monitoring the conclave's own relay network as part of standard session protocol. and the human embassy traffic was a significant spike that stood out clearly against the baseline. I noted it. I said nothing about it. In the 4th hour, a transmission arrived. It was addressed not to the conclave as a body, but to the individual homeworld governments of every member species, simultaneously, through 47 separate channels. The conclave communication system does not usually process 47 simultaneous incoming transmissions. It prioritizes, queues, and routes. The human transmission had somehow formatted itself to route to all 47 in parallel without going through the queue. Our communications director was still trying to work out how they had done that when the content of the message was read aloud in the chamber. It was one paragraph. It said, "Humanity is not interested in conflict. Humanity does not want to close jump lanes or disrupt conclave infrastructure. Humanity wants 3 things: the freedom to expand peacefully into unclaimed territory, the freedom to trade on equal terms with any species that wishes to trade with us, and the freedom to develop our own scientific and technological programs without external oversight. We have stated these wants through the correct diplomatic channels and through direct conversation, and we recognize that the conclave requires time to consider them. We want to be clear that we are done asking. We are stating. We look forward to a productive relationship with the Galactic Conclave and its member species, and we believe that relationship will be greatly improved by an honest understanding of where each of us stands." The message ended there. No signature, no name, no vessel designation or planetary origin marker. Just the paragraph, and then silence. The chamber was very quiet again. The Gallic representative said, to no one in particular, "They said they're done asking." I said, "Yes." He said, "That means they're prepared to act." I said, "I believe that is what it means." He thought about that for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected from him, given that he had drafted the original terms and argued for them in 5 separate pre-session briefings. He said, "Then we should talk about what a productive relationship actually looks like." It was a small sentence. It was not a dramatic turning point. The chamber did not applaud. Nobody made a speech. But the word relationship was different from the word compliance, and everyone in the chamber understood the difference, and the fact that the Gallic representative had used the first word instead of the second was a shift that I believe he did not even fully realize he was making. The session continued for another 3 hours. By the end of it, a subcommittee had been formed to draft a response to humanity's transmission. The response was not the conclave's counterterms. It was an invitation to further dialogue, an invitation to dialogue between parties who are, the phrasing in the draft read, recognized as having legitimate and significant interests in the outcome. Significant interests, not a minor species, not a footnote. I walked out of the grand chamber at the end of the session, into the cool air of Eurythus, and stood for a moment looking at the sky. The planet's 2 moons were visible even in daylight, small and pale. The city around me went about its business. The buildings were old, built from the same permanent mineral as the conclave's record walls, and they had stood for 3,000 years and were expected to stand for 3,000 more. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday. Everything was different. I thought about the tight beam signal from Kepler-7, 11 seconds long, sent toward empty space that was not empty. I thought about the cancellation order that had stopped something already in motion. I thought about what it meant that humanity's first instinct, upon receiving an ultimatum, had not been to broadcast their capabilities or issue counter-threats, but to send a quiet signal into the dark to something that was already on the way, and then tell it to wait. Patience that deep does not come from desperation. It comes from certainty. It comes from knowing that you have already done the work, and that the work was good, and that you simply need to wait for the right moment to let other people see it. Humanity had been patient for 80 years. The conclave had not been watching. That was the mistake. Not the terms, not the fleet, not any specific decision in any specific session. The mistake was the assumption that a species that was quiet was a species that was still. The assumption that a river moving around rocks was not thinking about rocks. Some rivers, it turns out, were not moving around rocks. They were just taking the long route. And at the end of the long route, they had built something that made the rocks irrelevant. I went back inside to draft the subcommittee's agenda. There was a great deal of work to do, and for the first time in this particular situation, I was genuinely uncertain how it would end. That uncertainty, I decided, was not a bad thing. It was, in its way, the most honest feeling I had experienced in years. The signing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning, New Geneva local time, which meant I arrived at the human embassy at 9:47, because arriving early to things is a habit I developed in the first decade of my career and have never been able to shake. I am Sisolu, and I was the only member of the original conclave delegation who had agreed to attend. The Kepler Accords, as they had come to be called, the name was chosen by the human side, and the conclave had not objected, possibly because no one wanted to be seen spending energy on the naming of a document that already represented enough concessions, gave humanity everything they had stated they wanted in that paragraph. Full trade access to 11 conclave commercial lanes, recognition of all 31 colonies, unmonitored development rights for all human scientific programs, a permanent seat on the main conclave council, and the contested outer systems, all of them, remaining under human authority. The conclave had received, in return, humanity's formal pledge not to deploy lane collapse devices against conclave infrastructure, and a trade agreement that gave conclave commercial vessels access to 6 human-controlled transit routes that were, our economists noted with some relief, genuinely useful. It was not nothing, but it was not the balance of the original terms, and everyone who read it understood that. The number of conclave diplomats who declined to attend the signing ceremony was 31. I had not expected to be in the minority among my colleagues. I came because I had been in the room at Kepler 7, and because I believed that being in the room for this was the correct continuation of having been in that one. The thread of that conversation needed to be followed to its end. That is what diplomats are for. The human embassy in New Geneva was a building I had visited once before, briefly, for a reception in the early days of the conclave's formal contact with humanity. I remembered it as large and modern, with the excessive lighting that humans seem to prefer in all interior spaces. Arriving now, it struck me differently. The building was the same, the lighting was the same, but I was looking at it with eyes that had seen what I had seen, and the building looked less like a functional government facility, and more like a very quiet statement. Its walls were covered in art. Not decorative art, historical art, paintings and photographs and rendered documents depicting human history, arranged chronologically from left to right along every corridor. I had not noticed this on my previous visit, or perhaps I had noticed it without understanding what I was looking at. Walking through the embassy now, following the human aide who was guiding me to the signing chamber, I slowed down to look. The earliest pieces showed conflict, not glorified, recorded. There was a difference. Human art depicting human combat did not look the way combat art looks in most species traditions. There was no grandeur to it. The figures in the paintings were tired and small against large landscapes. The photographs were factual. This happened. This is what it looked like. There were documents alongside the art. Treaties, the aide told me when I asked. Agreements and their dates. Records of when they had held and when they had not. Every war humanity had ever fought was on those walls. Every agreement. Every failure and every recovery. Arranged in order, making no argument, drawing no conclusions, simply existing as the record of what had happened and what had been learned. I thought about the conclave's record walls in the grand chamber, the panels of mineral that did not decay, the records of every agreement we had ever brokered. We recorded our successes in permanent material. Humanity recorded everything. Clara Voss was in the signing chamber when I arrived. She was standing at the window, looking out at the city, and she turned when I entered, with the same unhurried quality of movement she had shown at every point I had ever seen her. She was wearing a different jacket today, still dark, still plain, but this one had a small enamel pin on the lapel, in the shape of a stylized tree, which I had not seen before, and did not recognize the significance of. She said, "Ambassador, I'm glad you came." I said it seemed important to be present. She nodded, as if that was the exact answer she had expected, and moved toward the table where the accords were laid out. They were printed on physical paper, an unusual choice, and one the conclave delegation had questioned during the final drafting sessions. The human team had explained, politely, that they preferred physical documents for formal agreements, because physical documents cannot be altered after the fact. The conclave delegation had not pressed the point. I took my seat at the table. Across from me were 3 human signatories, including Clara Voss. There were no military officials present on either side. The conclave had sent 4 representatives in addition to myself. The room was smaller than I had expected. There were no cameras, no ceremony, no formal address. There was water on the table in plain carafes, and one of the human aides was making coffee in the corner, using a machine that made quiet mechanical sounds. I looked at Clara Voss. I said, "I have a question. It has been on my mind since Kepler 7, and I would like to ask it now, before we begin." She said, "Please." I said, "When did you decide? Not the accords, not the negotiation. But when did humanity decide that the quiet years would be what they were, that the answer to pressure from the conclave would be 80 years of preparation, rather than 80 years of diplomacy?" She was quiet for a moment, not thinking about whether to answer. I could tell the difference. She was choosing the right words, which is a different kind of quiet. Then she said, "There's a record on the wall on your way in. About a third of the way along the second corridor, there's a document, a copy of the original conclave assessment of humanity, from the first contact period." I said I had not paused at that particular document. She said, "It's the one that refers to us as a minor species with limited long-range development potential." She said it without sharpness, factually. The day our government received that assessment, there was a meeting, not a public one. I have the notes from it somewhere. The people in that meeting decided that they would only have the conversation we just had at Kepler 7 once. They decided that when the conversation came, and they believed it would come, they would be ready for it to be the last time anyone questioned whether humanity had a place in the galaxy. She paused. So they started building, and they waited. I said, "And you have been waiting since then?" She said, "Some of us were born into the waiting. By the time I was part of it, it was just the work. You do the work, and you trust that the work will matter when the moment arrives." She looked at me steadily. The moment arrived. The coffee machine made a final sound and was quiet. Outside the window, the city of New Geneva moved through a morning that looked, from inside this room, remarkably ordinary. People going to work, public transit moving along its routes, the light of this planet's sun coming through clouds that had rolled in during the night. I thought about the sphere above Kepler 7, 1,170 ships arranged in a perfect geometric shell, and not one weapon pointed. I thought about the signal sent into the velar drift, and then the second signal that called it back. I thought about the moment in the Grand Chamber when the Gallic representative had said the word relationship instead of compliance, and had not noticed the shift in what he was saying. I thought about how a river moves, not around rocks, through the long way, through the 80-year way, arriving exactly where it had always been going. I picked up the stylus and signed the accords. Clara Voss signed beside me. She did not make a speech. She did not look up at the ceiling or out the window. She signed her name with the focused attention of someone completing a task that has been a long time in the making, and then she set down the stylus and looked at the document for a moment before she looked at me. She said, "Ambassador, on behalf of humanity, thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For coming back." The aide in the corner offered coffee to the room. The human signatories accepted. The conclave representatives declined. One of the conclave representatives, seated at the far end of the table, asked about the enamel pin on Clara Voss's jacket, the tree, and she smiled and explained it was from a nature conservation organization she had been part of since she was a student. Something entirely unrelated to this, something she had simply never stopped caring about. The conversation that followed was, for the first time since I had met her, entirely ordinary. Questions and answers about things that did not involve fleets or devices, or signals sent into the dark. It lasted 20 minutes. By the end of it, 2 of my conclave colleagues were talking with one of the human signatories about comparative biology, and the aide had refilled the water carafes without anyone asking. I left the embassy at 11:15. My shuttle was waiting. Before I boarded, I stopped in the second corridor and found the document Clara Voss had described. It was exactly where she had said it would be, about a third of the way along, in a plain frame, a printed copy of the original conclave assessment of humanity from the first contact period. I read it. It was thorough and professional, and based on the best available information at the time. It categorized humanity's development trajectory, noted their limited interstellar range, assessed their political structures as potentially unstable, and concluded with a phrase that I had presumably read before, years ago, when the document was first filed, but had not thought about since. The phrase was, limited long-range development potential. I stood in that corridor and looked at that phrase for a long time. I thought about the report I would write when I returned to the conclave. I had been composing it in pieces during the months of the Accords negotiation. I knew what most of it would say, but I had been uncertain about the conclusion, about what the correct lesson was, the thing that should be extracted from everything that had happened and set down in permanent language for the conclave to carry forward. Standing in that corridor, looking at limited long-range development potential, I knew what the conclusion would say. It would say, we made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, not a diplomatic mistake, a fundamental mistake of attention. We looked at a species that was quiet, and we decided the quiet meant they were still. We looked at a river moving slowly, and decided it was moving carefully, because it was afraid of what lay ahead. We did not look at where it was going. We did not look at what it was building while it moved. We did not look at the 80 years of work that was happening in a part of space we had assessed as too difficult to be worth monitoring closely. The mistake was not the terms we offered or the fleet we sent. The mistake was the assumption that a species that could be made afraid would be. The assumption that showing something to a species and saying this is what we have was the same as the species understanding what you were saying. The humans understood what we were saying. We never asked what they were saying back. They were not saying nothing during those 80 years. They were building something in the dark, quietly, without any of the signals that a species sends when it is afraid, or desperate, or reaching for help. They were building with the calm of people who had already decided how this would go, and were simply doing the work of making it true. I walked out of the embassy into the morning. The sun was through the clouds now. The city sounded the way a city sounds when nothing unusual is happening in it. Somewhere in the Velar Drift, 9,000 ships sat in the dark near the photospheres of 17 red dwarf stars, waiting for a signal that was not going to come, standing down from a readiness that had never been called forward. I thought, that is the sound of a species that has already won something, not loudly, not with speeches or ceremonies or weapons pointed at the sky, just quietly, steadily, with the particular confidence of knowing that the work was done, and had been done well, and that all that remained was to let the rest of the galaxy catch up. I boarded the shuttle. I finished my report on the transit home. The last line read, "We assumed that because they could lose, they were afraid to. They had simply decided they would not." That decision, made 80 years before anyone in this chamber had heard the word Kepler-7, was the entire event. Everything that followed was already determined. We were, from the moment that decision was made, reading the conclusion of a sentence humanity had begun writing, before any of us thought to pay attention. Pay attention. That is what the report said, at the end, in language that was as plain as I could make it. Pay attention to the quiet ones. Pay attention to the rivers that take the long route. Pay attention to the dark spaces on the map that you've marked as too difficult to be worth watching. Pay attention, especially, to the species that sits across a table from 17 warships and does not look at the ceiling. They are not afraid. They already know how the story ends.